President Trump and the Fed. Would we see a jumbo cut tomorrow? And how low may rates go in the end? Hello Diamond NestEgg members, super savers and course fans. I hope you had a great start to the week and welcome back to Markets with Markus. So this week's big event is the next announcement by the Fed about our rates. So they'll announce it tomorrow, I think at 2 p.m. in the early afternoon. And it's then when we will know whether they will cut the rates and by how much. So it's no secret that President Trump wants lower rates. We looked a bit on his social media posts and we found this post that's been often quoted from June 30th that essentially is very direct and explicit. It says we should be paying 1% interest or better. Now, he tries to underscore his point by showing a table with the world's central bank rates, the interest rates around the world, that shows that whereas the US, as end of June, as of now, was at 4.50%, so the upper end of the range that we have, this is higher than in many other of our leading trading partners, including China and the Eurozone. President Trump then drew an arrow on top of the chart, pointed at some of the countries with the lowest rates, including Japan, Switzerland, and said, should be here. So that's the range he wants. And he added, handwritten, Jerome, you are, as usually, too late. So that's a bit of public pressure, clearly. But presidents usually want lower rates and are often not shy to be forceful about that, let's say. The history books tell us that being called too late isn't even the worst thing that has happened to a Fed chair before. Lyndon B. Johnson, when he was unhappy with his Fed chair, summoned him to his ranch in Texas and then pushed him against a wall and continued to shout at him, demanding lower rates. Now, from what we could hear and from what we understand, it didn't really work. But that's really the reason, I guess, why Congress made the Fed independent. So, if the Fed is independent day to day, how can President Trump or any other president influence the Fed besides applying public pressure? Well, the key tool is the appointment of new members to the Fed's board, or Fed governors as they are called. Because these 7 Fed governors are voting members of the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, that votes on our rates. That's the committee that is meeting currently and will announce its decision tomorrow. So once appointed, those Fed governors are appointed for 14 years and are independent and can only be removed for cause. So that means you never know exactly how they will behave once they're insulated, but the assumption is clearly that every president wants to appoint governors that will do, think more or less along the same lines that the president does. Now, as we just said, the Fed board has 7 members, and 3 of those positions are currently being worked on by President Trump, so to speak, where he wants to essentially put someone in that he thinks will be more aligned with his thinking on interest rates. So the first is Jerome Powell. That's been well publicized. No? Jerome Powell has been at the receiving end of many of President Trump's tweets and social postings. For a while, it even looked like President Trump might try to fire Jerome Powell, though that has now probably become more and more unlikely from what we read. But in any case, Powell's term as chair will end in May 2026, so roughly half a year from now. And Trump has begun already to publicly speculate about who he may appoint as his successor. So clearly one of the positions where he may try to put someone in who may be a bit softer on interest rates. The second Fed governor that's currently been in the news is Lisa Cook. Lisa Cook was appointed by President Biden for a term that will be running until January 2038. Now remember, once appointed, Fed governors can only be removed for cause, and that's exactly what Trump is trying to do here. So the background here is that the administration, President Trump, claims that Lisa Cook made wrong statements of fact on her mortgage application. So you need to know that when you take out a mortgage, banks have made the experience that mortgages for your primary home, your main residence, are usually the mortgages that are the most likely to be repaid. Because if it's your primary home, it's your home, you will do whatever you can to make this mortgage not default, to keep that home. Take a second job, save on other expenses. On the other hand, if the mortgage is for a vacation home, or maybe even for a home that you intend to rent out, you may still, of course, try not to lose that home. Now, who likes losing a home? But you may not be willing to put in the same effort to make the same sacrifices in order not to default. And for that reason, you usually get lower rates on a mortgage for a primary home, and it's also easier to get. So that's the core, essentially, of the allegations, that Lisa Cook lied on her mortgage application in order to get a better rate on some of the mortgages she took out for homes that may or may not have been her primary residence. Now, while this is clearly a federal crime, it's a fraud, mortgage fraud in technical terms. It's not very often enforced, by the way, as far as we know, but it is in the books. She claims that even if this were to be proven true, it may not be cause for getting her fired, because it was done not as a Fed official, but as a private person, and even before she took her seat as a Fed governor. So essentially, the argument is to be fired for cause, it needs to relate to some kind of bad behavior while you're sitting in an official duty. So the case is working its way through the courts. Both sides have been appealing. The ultimate decision, as so often, will be with the Supreme Court. But the lower courts, the District Court and the Court of Appeals, have at least so far said that Lisa Cook may continue to sit as a Fed governor before the Supreme Court makes its final decision. So Lisa Cook will be participating today and tomorrow and will be able to vote. And then there's the third position that's in play, so to speak. This position was vacated by Adriana Kugler. She essentially had a term that was due to expire in January 2026. Anyway, she resigned a bit earlier over the summer, and as far as we could tell, has resumed teaching as a professor at Georgetown University with the beginning of the semester. So that seems to have been her reason to leave a few months earlier. President Trump has now appointed Stephen Myron to fill in for Adriana Kugler until January 2026. And this has been raising some questions about Fed independence. You need to know that Stephen Myron, in his main job, used to be the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors to the president, and has publicly said that he will return to that position when his temporary term at the Fed ends. So how independent is that? It's clearly just a temporary job. He wants to return to be the close economic advisor to President Trump. And on top, we know that his economic thinking is very aligned with President Trump's. How do we know that? Some of you may have seen our video from a few months ago, where we introduced Stephen Myron as the architect of the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord. That's like a shorthand that's being used in the markets for a more dryly titled paper that's really officially called A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. So in this paper, Stephen Myron argued that the dollar as the world's reserve currency is much in demand, but it's overvalued because so many people want to buy it, not to buy American goods, but hold dollars as a currency reserve. And that contributes to a chronic trade deficit. We import more than we export, which means less employment in America, less manufacturing in America. So Myron proposes 3 sets of remedies: tariffs, very much aligned with President Trump, a burden sharing with our allies. He floated an idea of having long-term zero coupon bonds that we could persuade our allies to buy to help share the burden that we have for defending them when worst comes to worst. And he's also not afraid of a weaker dollar. Now, before we jump to conclusions, Myron in this paper also says you have to be more careful with financial markets than with tariffs. So we'll see how that translates into his voting behavior today and tomorrow, essentially, which will be the first test. So what should we expect tomorrow before that background then? As we just explained, with the positions that are in play, besides Jerome Powell, you have now 3 voting Trump appointees and 3 voting Biden appointees on the board. So Jerome Powell really has the decisive vote. Given that Powell in Jackson Hole, we've spoken about that before on this channel, has pretty much signaled that he's open to a cut to preserve employment. The market has been pricing in a 25 basis points cut pretty much as a certainty, though you never know before it's not done. And a 50-point jumbo cut, as the market calls it, would not be likely for tomorrow, but it's still possible. So now, however that ends tomorrow, whether it's a 25 basis point cut or 50 basis point cut, that's not the end of the story anyway. It's the beginning. Because usually when the Fed starts cutting rates, it often continues doing so. The last example was in the fall of 2024, when the Fed started cutting rates, they made, within a few weeks, 3 cuts for a total of 100 basis points, 1 percentage point. So a lot of people, a lot of market observers think that it may be the same this time, that a rate cut seldom comes alone, so to speak. So where will it end? How low may rates go? And will there be something like a natural level for interest rates in the US that we can return to? Now, if we look at the next chart, for those of you who watch us on video, you can see that over the past 70 years or so, there isn't really a natural level of rates that has been really dominating. You can clearly come to an average if you want, but it always depends on the macroeconomic environment. So you see in the 70s and 80s, before inflation got tamed again, rates were much higher than they were in the past, let's say 15 years, when especially after the great financial crisis, it could almost feel like rates close to zero were the new normal. And we had them after the global financial crisis, then it went up again, but we had near zero rates again after COVID. Now we're clearly much higher. So where will it end? Will we go back to near zero? I personally don't think so. Too much has changed. The environment is different. We have a different international trade climate, but who knows, right? And at the end, it will really depend how the economy is doing, and in particular, how the Fed will balance its dual mandate. Because now the Fed, as we know, has the dual mandate, as it's called, of maintaining both price stability and maximum employment. That said, it only has one tool to achieve that, the interest rate. And that becomes tricky when, like right now, those tools are in conflict. So currently, and we've spoken about that before as well, employment is softening, which would call for lower rates, whereas inflation is a bit more persistent and a bit above the Fed's target rate. So that would call for the same or higher rates. So we'll see how that goes. Maybe we'll learn a bit tomorrow, not just from the rate decision that the Fed makes, but also from the statement that Chairman Powell will give after in a press conference. So the markets seem to be confident that the rates will be cut by 25%. There were no major market moves today. And we all, I think, have to wait and see how it ends tomorrow. So, all right, Diamond NestEgg members, super service and course fans, I hope you enjoyed today's video, learned something new, and see you hopefully again tomorrow to discuss the outcomes of the Fed meeting.